Hello students, I hope everyone's well, keeping warm. I hope you have power. I have power for now. My internet's out, my water's out, but I do have power, so I'm happy about that. Okay, so we are now in unusual time here because I have this week 20 and this week 21 that I'm dealing with. So you have the homework for week 20, and week 21 you just have a series of questions to answer. And so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to pretty much skip 20. I have this picture up here just to give us a background of some of the things that happens in 20. It's called Around the World in 4 days or something like this. There's a lot of work there. I need you to still do it, but you'll be learning about really cool things. For instance, you'll be learning about China and the Sui dynasty, how they built the Grand Canal. They invented pound locks to make locks between the areas so they could reach different parts of the country. Next would come the Tang dynasty or Tang dynasty. It's considered the golden age of China. They had beautiful ceramics. Apparently, they invented chairs. They had robust trade through the Silk Road. They invented paper and printing. We always think about Gutenberg with the movable type. Well, the Chinese had it first. It was just with wooden blocks instead of metal blocks. And also they had time for beautiful, not just art, but poetry. Some of the great poets of all Chinese history are in the time of the Tang dynasty. Then we have the Mongol invasion. Genghis Khan and his golden horde on their horses come in and take over. There are many wars, many battles take place to the point that his grandson Kublai Khan will establish the Yuan dynasty in China. So the Chinese will actually be run by Mongols for some period of time. The Kublai Khan's dynasty was magnificent. It was filled with beautiful art as well. Furthermore, that's the time Marco Polo ended up over in China. And so Marco Polo got to meet with Kublai Khan. Kublai wasn't successful in everything. He tried to invade Japan a couple of times, and he was unsuccessful in that. After that, the Chinese will come back to a Chinese dynasty called the Ming dynasty. They were the ones that built the Forbidden City, which can still be visited today, and were very famous for their ceramics. You've probably heard of the Ming vase, and so that you'll learn about. Furthermore, we have Russia. You'll learn about Ivan the Great and how he actually kicked the Mongols out. The Mongols were in charge of Russia at the time too, and same time as China. He kicked them out and began to build a country, very cold up in Russia. We know about cold now, don't we? And he built started the city of Moscow and Red Square and this kind of things. Well, it's called Red Square now. It wasn't called that then. It's called the Kremlin. After him comes Ivan the Terrible, who built inside the Kremlin one of the most beautiful pieces of architecture ever built called St. Basil's Cathedral. You'll read about it. We'll read about the Ottoman Empire and Sultan Mehmed and the fall of Constantinople, how he renamed the city. It's not Constantinople, it's called Istanbul. And Suleiman the Magnificent, we actually met with him. We'll meet with him when he tries to invade Italy at one point. Then you'll finish up with Japan. That's our picture right here. You'll learn about the geography, the different islands that are there, Mount Fuji, and this is, of course, the flower blossoms, the cherry blossoms of Japan. So have fun with that, doing the homework on that week, getting that accomplished and learning those things. I'm sorry I don't have the time to spend on that because I want to move on to 21 where you have, I believe, unless it's changed, you'll have a series of questions about that. But I do want to also inform you about, you'll see in week 21 there will be an assignment. It's on my curriculum, it's on 969. It might be a different page number for you. Anyway, that assignment is about doing a PowerPoint of some sort of project. Wait a minute, maybe it's picking a project, and the week 25 assignment is a PowerPoint of a biography. So here's what I'm going to do on that. I'm actually combining those together, and you are going to take that assignment. You're going to do it. The biography is going to be a PowerPoint assignment, okay? And you're going to present that on the very last day of class. Okay, so I'm going to keep going through the history. You'll be working on this project, and if you read on that page 969 or whatever page it is in your curriculum, it'll explain to you how long it should be, something like 5 slides long. You know, my slides when I go through a PowerPoint are like 150 slides. Okay, so you're only going to have like 5 or 6 slides. So you're going to be picking somebody, be thinking about anybody from the history that we've been learning about, I would avoid Americans at this point because you can just save that for American history. Go with a world history person that has piqued your interest throughout this time, and then give us some really interesting information, even if we haven't learned about them. If I never talked about them, but it's somebody from history. One time I had a student do a family member, somebody who had survived the Holocaust and that kind of thing. So anything like that would be fine with me. Okay, you may want to let me know about it, and I can let you know if it'll be appropriate. Okay, so just letting you know, when you find those assignments coming up, that I've got those melded together and put in the back, the last day of class. And every week we'll continue to have a lecture. Some of them I will divide in two so I can cover all the information there. Okay, so what we're learning about now is really covered in 21, I think, for the most part. And you don't have any homework on that day, on that week, okay? You just have these notes to pull out. So if you want to stop the recording now, go find those pages. It's right after 969, and see if you can answer some of the notes that I'll be talking to you about today, okay? We're going to be looking at absolutism in Europe. Absolutism is mean to absolutely rule. It's an absolute monarchy, or despotic, a despot. It's a form of monarchy in which one ruler has supreme authority that is not restricted by any written laws, legislature, or customs. He's the king, and there's nobody can dispute that. All right, in 1603, we have the death of Elizabeth. Okay, you remember she was never married, never had any children, and I believe I told you at the end of her life, she had put one of the men that she was one of her favorites, she had requested that he be executed for being a traitor. And she was so upset about it, it had broken her heart, really. And so she laid down on a pillow crying. Then her maid of honor, one of her maids in waiting, was her best friend. She died, and Elizabeth was despondent, and she wouldn't even get off the pillows of her floor. And everybody was like, and she wouldn't eat. She wouldn't eat any food. And so they said, Your Majesty, please, get up. And I think they finally got her to her bed, but she died. And they asked her to name her successor. Who would it be? And we're going to see right here that who is it going to be? So we see that she's got, so it's Edward marrying her, right? So who's going to take over after her? So over here we have her, remember Mary Queen of Scots, her cousin whom she loves so dearly, right? And the son is James the Sixth. So they did ask her as she's laying there in her bed, they said, will your nephew, James the Sixth, be the new king? And they said she nodded in assent. We don't know for sure, but she had never had anything written down. That's for sure right there. So now we're looking at James the Sixth of Scotland will become James the First of England. All right, you can see here the Tudor rose. And apparently, I've never been able to figure out this thistle part right here, but that's apparently the Stuart. Remember, his father was Darnley Stuart, and that was a cousin. So Mary was Mary Stuart. And you can see that's apparently the Stuart family crest right there. So he's united that. So for the first time here, we have Scotland and England unified under one king, and it's James. And he's going to introduce something known as Stuart absolutism. He believes in the divine right of kings. Remember, he was raised in Scotland under the tutelage very early in his life of John Knox, and then Protestants after that of the Reformed Church. So he's Protestant. Now, the people are wondering, at this point, his mother was a good Catholic. He's raised Protestant. Elizabeth had that middle way. What is James going to do about religion? What's going to happen? He believed in the divine right. Of course, God put him there. And he decided soon after he was crowned that he would become the head of the Church of England. And this upset many Catholics who had high, high hopes that he would indeed take over as a Catholic like his mother, and he would bring the country back to Catholicism. That's not going to happen, but there is a plot. We know there were many plots against Elizabeth, namely from Catholics, namely from Mary and those who were supporting her. And now there's a group of Catholics who are going to have a plot, and let's watch what happens. Okay, I have a video for you here. It's November 5th, 1605, and we're going to see the plot of the Catholics. And this is a guy named Guy Fawkes, And we have this great poem right here. Remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. And you can read the rest yourself right there. This plot will not work out, okay? It's going to be found out, and we'll see why. This is a very silly comedy routine. It's called The Terrible Tutors. It's hilarious, but it is accurate, so pay attention. Oops. There we go. Okay, so that is the funny story of what's called the gunpowder plot. To this day in England, they actually celebrate on the 5th of November by having fireworks and things like that. And they actually burn effigies of Guy Fawkes. All right, so he's considered, I don't know, the bad guy or whatever, but he failed. So whether or not there was gunpowder that was put down into the bottom of Parliament, but I don't believe he was actually standing there with his match. I think that's a little bit simplistic. But he was caught. He did give up the other people. They were all captured and put in the tower, of course, and executed. And at this point, it makes James a little paranoid. You can't really blame him, can you? But I think this poem is what children in England memorize, right? So they all know this story. Okay, so there's our video. There were other plots as well, and some people thought that Walter Raleigh was implicated in some of the plots. At least King James believed he was. All right, so he had Walter Raleigh. Remember, Walter Raleigh had been put in the tower by Elizabeth when he had married without her permission, and he ended up writing his book called The History of the World and doing all this great stuff, but she finally let him out. Well, now he's going to be put in the tower for good as a plotter. I don't know that he was a Catholic, so I don't know that it had to do with that, but here he is back in the tower, and then he got executed. So it was during King James' reign that Walter Raleigh did lose his head, sadly. All right, now, speaking of colonizers like Walter Raleigh, we have a new colony that's going to form. The first one, remember, that Walter Raleigh had tried to establish was the Roanoke, lost colony of Roanoke right there, the one that mysteriously disappeared. And now the new colony is coming over here. Now James is looking at the New World kind of like the Spanish had looked at it. What can they get out of it? All right, so they weren't going to go down there the region where Spain was. That was called the Spanish Main. But all along the coast of North America had been unclaimed. And so they thought they'd go to that, what was called Virginia Territory, named that by Walter Raleigh, and start a new colony to get materials. And namely, the materials they were going to get would be lumber and things like that, and of course look to see if they could find some gold. So it was all men that went. The colony gets established. It's called Jamestown after the king. They built a fort. That was one of the first things they did, and it's this very famously triangular shaped fort. When you take American history, you're going to learn all about this and how this all came about with the help of this man right here, John Smith, Colonel John Smith, who kind of took over as he had natural leadership abilities and took over. And he, of course, was supposedly saved by the heroic works of Pocahontas. Here it is, right here, when he was about to be killed by Pocahontas' father, Powhatan. And here she is saving his life. And there's something similar went on that way. So there's some truth to that story. Okay. But you know of King James, obviously, because the Bible. So one of the first things he wanted to do was to get the Bible written down in a very systematic way in English. Okay, remember prior to this, the idea of having the Bible written in anything besides the Latin, the Vulgate, would be thought of as anathema, right? But here we are looking at a church that's not Catholic. And James brought in, he was talked in, somebody came to him and said, let's do this. And he said, that's a great idea. Bring in all the scholars from the area. And then they ended up writing this verse by verse of the entire Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And of course, the English language that they used became kind of the standard use of the language at the time. It's very, very beautiful. I would have my kids and my students read like certain verses out of the King James, and it's very poetic and lovely. Sometimes we might think of it as difficult to understand because of the old kind of language there. And we've had certainly different translations to come on to try to make that language a little more modernized and help us to understand it a little better. But I will say that the King James is still a beautiful, beautiful translation of the Bible and very well done. and I think puts King James on the map as one of the great kings, right? Because he wasn't a very nice guy. They say he was kind of snooty, and he had these skinny legs, and he used to eat real messy, like he would put food in his mouth and it would fall out of his mouth. He was just kind of, yeah, not a very pleasant guy. Oh, here's one of those verses right here, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. In the King James Version, just lovely. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. A great verse right there, and so lovely in the King James Version. All right, so we have this state religion that's been established. It's the Church of England, and James is the head of the church, so he's in charge. So we have religious uniformity. Everyone in England must belong to the Church of England. They are not allowed to go to the Catholic Church. It's sort of like when Edward had, put out that book of prayer. So he's going to have this new Bible for people to use and to come to church and show that uniformity. So turns out, though, not everybody agreed with him, right? We have these Protestants that aren't quite in agreement. So James is a Protestant. It's called Anglican. But some other groups of people thought that it wasn't Protestant enough. So in other words, that James had taken on some of Elizabeth's idea of that middle way, maybe having a little too much ceremony, that kind of thing. So we have this group called the Puritans. Now the Puritans want to purify the church from within. So they want to work at the church systematically, going through convincing people that they need to have some certain changes. Okay, so they're going to stay within the church and try to change things. Another group called the Separatists believe there's no way that changes can take place, certainly not in a timely manner. They want to separate themselves out from them. So they are also Puritan-like, but they separate themselves. We call them the Separatists. These are the Pilgrims, all right? And they want to meet in homes, having, home Bible study kind of thing. And that is not legal, okay? It's not legal to do that. And so they're going to end up getting in trouble, including our Pilgrims that founded the colony in America. They ended up having to actually leave England and go over to Holland for a little while. And then, of course, they got on that famous Mayflower ship and headed over to the New World. And that happened in 1620. There it is. There's the Mayflower. And we're going to see how they left the security, if you will, of England and Europe to go try something new. And this was all in the name of religious freedom. Don't let anybody tell you that America was founded for some other reason besides religious freedom. It wasn't. It was founded because they wanted to establish this freedom. Here they are making their Mayflower Compact. When you study this in American history, you'll find out, and maybe you already know this, that they actually got blown off course. They were supposed to be headed toward Virginia, closer to the Jamestown area. They were blown off course, ended up in Massachusetts. And when they got there, they realized that their deal that they had made wasn't really covered under their contract with the King James. So they made a new one called the Mayflower Compact, when they all decided, it's a beautiful piece of literature, if you will. It's a legal document where all the men on board signed it to say that they would honor the king. So they decided they were going to still be a British colony over there in the New World. Here they are stepping foot on Plymouth Rock. Yeah, it was a rough time. Oh my goodness, it was such. We're having a hard winter right now. These guys had a bad winter. More than half of them died that first winter. Very heroic, these people. After the next year came, after the winter came, then the next fall came. They did have a big celebration that we know as Thanksgiving now. Happened at the time of the harvest. And you'll find that their Thanksgiving, of course, was to thank God, not to thank the Indians, even though they did invite some Indians to come to be a part of that. The Indians had helped them, but they were thanking God, absolutely. Okay, so now we're back to James. He had 7 children who had survived. To be honest with you, I don't know his wife's name. He had married her way before now when he was still in Scotland. So he had a son named Henry who died at age 18. We have Elizabeth, interesting, named after his cousin. Elizabeth of England would be his cousin. Margaret, Charles, Robert, Mary, and Sophia. Okay, so we're going to see that Charles will be next in line. Since Henry died at 18, Charles will become the next king after James is out. And here he is. So James ruled for some time, And then he died, and his son Charles is going to take over. So now the big question is here, what is Charles going to do about religion? Okay, he was raised by his father in Protestant. He told everybody he was absolutely a Protestant. He did believe in the divine right of kings. In that particular case, he believed that he could do no wrong, that whatever decision he made was the right decision. And he got the people kind of concerned when he married a woman who was a Catholic French princess. In fact, I believe she's the sister of Louis XIII, right? So this would have been Marie de Medici's daughter, Maria Henrietta, or something like that. Yeah, I think I have her name coming up here. So we're going to see these things that are listed here. Okay, we're going to go through each one of these right here. Okay, all right. Here she is, Henrietta Maria. I think I said it the wrong way. I believe she is the sister of Louis XIII. This was unpopular for him to marry a French. First of all, she's French. Secondly, she's Catholic, very Catholic, and people are concerned because she'll have sway over her husband, over his heart, over this Catholicism. In fact, he kind of acts a little bit like a Catholic. So the people became suspicious of his commitment to Protestantism, and there were stories being told out there about wicked Catholic stuff, but probably made up. He has his family now, and we can see his son Charles, then a daughter named Mary, a son named James, a daughter named Elizabeth, Anne, Henry, and Henrietta. We're going to see Charles, Mary, James, and Anne all become important in the Stuart line of the kingdom here. So that, I believe, is Charles right here, standing there with a very large dog. Okay, so they're doing well. His Catholic wife did great for him. He was a big spender. He liked lavish parties. He had very expensive taste. One of his things that he really, really loved was paintings, and he really, really loved having paintings made of himself. All right, so here he is on a horse. He had his favorite painter of the period right here, a Flemish painter who painted him. His name is Van Dyck, and I think we'll talk a little bit when I show you a picture of him standing up about Van Dyck's technique here. Now, Parliament always had to approve the release of funds, and they started to squawk when the king kept asking for more money. Okay, so he said, I need money for this painting, or money for this trip, or money for this party, or this kind of thing. And after a while, they said, we're not going to give you that money. Here is his chief advisor, the Duke of Buckingham. His name is George Villiers. And Villiers was not popular at all. He used to flirt with the girls. This is it. And you may have heard this little nursery rhyme thing here. Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie Porgy ran away. And the idea was that he flirted with all these other men's wives, but when the men would challenge him, he would run away. He didn't want to fight or have any duels or anything like that. But he was not popular at all. Here he is still, and it says here, this is what Parliament used to say about him. Who rules the kingdom? The king. Who rules the king? The Duke. And who rules the Duke? The devil. All right, so they hated him. They really believed he had too much influence on the king. The king was really interested in things like parties and paintings and things like this, art, stuff like this, and it was really Buckingham who was ruling the country. So they hated him so much that there was a plot that was formed, and he was attacked and assassinated. Okay, can you tell what's happening in this picture right here? Somebody was hiding behind the curtain, I believe, and here's the Duke right here. He gets stabbed. Here's our assassin running away. I believe that's the knife flying out after it stabbed Buckingham. Buckingham was dead. All right, so now the king is on his own. The Buckingham used to always make, every time the king wanted something, he would go to Parliament and demand the Parliament respond to the king positively. So Parliament has the power of the purse. They're the ones who make the decision where the money goes. Charles wants money for various things, and they finally put their foot down, and they were like, nope, we're not going to do that to you. He says, give me money. They said no. He said, fine, and he dissolved Parliament. He said, go away. I can run the country without you. So Parliament was dissolved for about 11 years. All right? And so how did Charles get money that way? So he had this sort of end around that he used. It's called ship money. When he couldn't get Parliament to give him money, there was a tax that had already existed. Coastal areas had to pay for it, and the coastal areas were paying for improvements made on ports and things for ships to come in. So that's what the tax was for. That's why it's called ship money. So he started requesting ship money from everyone. Okay, so and they had to pay this tax directly to him, and he was able to use that for paintings and beautiful clothes and things like this. So take a look at this painting right here. This is painted by Van Dyck. He was that Flemish painter I was telling you about. He had a technique that was really very it made his subjects look beautiful. Okay, so what he did was he sort of stretched. I'll get my pointer on that. Stretch their body out a little bit, okay? So he made their head this size, and then added, I think, 7 heads down here. He gave them the perspective was a little off. What's the word I'm looking for? And it elongated them a little bit, and it was very it beautified them. And so it made everybody look wonderful. So it was kind of a style at the time that they would show him in this way. Maybe it wasn't super accurate, but it did sort of elongate and stretch them out just a little bit. At this point, there was a revolt. Now, the Scots revolted. Yeah, they were very much about, their special brand of Protestantism. They didn't necessarily want the New James Bible. They liked their Book of Common Prayer. They liked the stuff that had come up with John Knox earlier. And so they started, here's the pastor was commanded to preach out of that New King James Version and out of, I guess, the Common Prayer of not Scotland but England. And the people were upset. They started literally throwing things at him during the church service. And it ended up in a revolt. So now Charles has to get an army to go meet the Scottish revolt. And guess what armies take? They take money. He needed money. And so he was going to have to call up the Parliament. So we'll get to that in just a minute. At this point, we have some more pilgrims, some more separatists, and even now Puritans have decided to go ahead and leave. They saw what was happening over in the New World with the pilgrims and said, well, if they can make it after that really rough time, we can make it too. So they made a new colony over here called Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is now the area called Boston. So Plymouth Colony would have been over here in this part of Massachusetts, in this little hook area right here, so Plymouth. And then we have Boston's a little farther up, and several other colonies are going to come about too. So this is 1630. All right, so here's what I was talking that Charles called up the Parliament. He said, okay, Parliament, come up. I need money for this battle, for this war in Scotland. And they started putting up a stink saying, we're not going to give you money for anything. We're going to make the decisions. And so he was very arrogant because, remember, the divine right of kings. He says, no, I'm right. You're wrong. So this is known as short Parliament because he said, okay, you're done. Bye. See you. And he dissolved it again. So he said, I'll figure out something on my own. Well, he couldn't. So he had to call him back up. And this next one, let me go back here, is called Long Parliament. And it's called that because the very first thing that they did was to pass this law called the Petition of Right. All right. So this was a declaration of rights passed by Parliament saying that the king could not dissolve Parliament. That's what it said. Okay, so now he can't do that anymore. And so now they're going to take up. That's why it's called Long Parliaments, and they're going to meet for a long time. And we're going to see how that turns out. So at some point, Charles comes in. He actually enters into Parliament. This was not a legal act. He believes, of course, he's the king. He can do whatever he wants. But this is considered, I don't know if illegal is the right word, or just very bad manners. But I think according to the people in Parliament, they thought it was not right for him to show up there. This was their domain, right? They would talk to him in the proper avenues, but not in Parliament, not in the buildings of Parliament. So actually, some of them said this is bad enough that this is actually going to devolve into war, bringing us to the English Civil War. Okay. Goes from 1642 to 1651. It was long and brutal. Kind of fits and starts, battles and then lulls and things like this. So we have the group supporting Parliament. This would be they're called the Roundheads because of the helmets. See how the helmets are round right there? So they're called Roundheads. And then we have the Cavaliers. Now look at their headwear. See, they've got those beautiful kind of flamboyant hats with the feather coming out. They also had really long hair. Mostly, I will say that a lot of these guys, their hair was actually wigs. Long wigs. It was quite the style at the time to wear the wigs. These guys might have actually had long hair. It looks kind of short here, but could have been a little longer. But they weren't wigs. It was their regular hair right there. So we're going to now go through what happened in the English Civil War. This was a bona fide civil war, people uprising against each other. It's going to be those loyal to the king versus those who they think the king is too arrogant, this kind of thing. All right, so it's almost kind of even on the sides there. All right, so the king is literally fighting battles. He has an army behind him that go into certain battles. And then the leader of the Roundheads, a young kind of man, he's a young man that rises up almost unexpectedly. His name is Oliver Cromwell. Now, you know that name Cromwell. Remember from Thomas Cromwell? He is related to Oliver, but distantly. I think he was some sort of distant uncle or something like that. So, but he's a new Cromwell. He was, I would say, probably of the lower level landed gentry. He grew up in he wasn't wealthy, okay, not wealthy at all. But he ended up actually inheriting some land from an uncle who died, and therefore had his vote. And he came to Long Parliament. He got put into the House of Commons at Long Parliament, and he was one of the ones who was making this stand against the king. And when it came time for battles, he actually formed his own army, and his army tended to be successful against the king's army. I'm going to see a couple of these. The Battle of Edgehill ended up with not really anybody winning this battle. It was kind of an even draw right here. But here's the king making his plan to go and fight. We can see the forming up of the army back over here. We have quite a bit of cavalry right there. In fact, you'll see here we have a cavalry charge coming in. So I think both sides kind of claimed victory here, but nobody really won this one. But then we get Cromwell training the army. He said, here's our problem. We lack discipline. What the king's army has is a long tradition of fighting for the king. They have a certain understanding of the quote-unquote rules of war. And so what I want to do is I want to train up our guys who haven't been in the upper echelons of the army. They may have been fighting before, but they were fighting down in the lower ranks. And so he gets them together. He starts to train them very, very rigorously, and they become an incredible army. They really do. They call it the New Model Army. And after Cromwell took his army out and won a few battles, they wanted Cromwell to come in and train everybody. And so he ended up becoming kind of the head of the whole army at one point. Okay. So we're going to see here they are all lined up in regimental, and they're going to end up winning some battles now. Marston Moor was one of those battles. Here they are at 1644 now. So the Cavalier army, that would be the king's army, were under the leadership of a guy called Rupert of the Rhine. I think this might be him right here. But he was kind of a very flamboyant character, arrogant. He came into the battles, ready to fight. But he was always had his good luck charm with him, was a little dog. He literally was holding a little dog with him while he went into battle. Some small dog. I don't see him here in the picture. I don't know what happened to him. But this right here was a defeat for the Royalists, okay? A defeat for the Cavaliers. So the New Model Army won here, okay? And it shocked everybody pretty much that this happened, and it caused a regroup. I will tell you that this was called the First Civil War. So many people divide the English Civil War into two parts. Okay, so we have Marston Moor is going to be a defeat, and then we have the next one here is going to be Naseby. And Naseby is also a defeat, specifically under Cromwell, and he was at Marston Moor as well. But Naseby is going to be a defeat as well, and actually they will end up, the king will end up surrendering and going actually up to, here they are getting the news. I believe that's Cromwell getting the news that they've won. Okay, and the king is going to surrender to the Scots, I believe, yeah. And when he surrenders to the Scots, up in Scotland, he thinks he's going to have some sort of, the Scottish are going to treat him with some sort of respect because remember he was Scottish. Remember his father was James, but actually the Scots ended up selling him to Oliver Cromwell and to the England for money, and so he ends up going back there, and they try so hard. I will say that Cromwell does work very hard to get the king to accept something called a constitutional monarchy. Kind of like the Magna Carta situation, where he's going to go ahead and say he's under the same laws, that the parliament actually has essentially more power than the king. And so the king is so prideful, and he's refusing and refusing to do that. And they're kind of at an impasse, and they put him in his room to be under lock and key, if you will. He's in the tower, maybe. I don't know for sure. Anyway, he ends up escaping. When he escapes, he goes and forms a new army, and they have several more battles, but then they get defeated. So some people divided into two pieces. The first Civil War, then the king escapes, new army, second Civil War. So that's kind of, I don't know if that's new or whatever, but I just know they call it the first Civil War, the second Civil War. So the second time when the king does surrender again, at this point it's much more difficult for the Puritans. Remember, Cromwell would have been a Puritan, the Roundheads, and these Puritans to accept the king because they don't think they can trust him. He's not doing what they want him to do. He won't agree to a constitutional monarchy still at this point. And so they decide, what are we going to do? We should bring him to trial. So Cromwell, who's still very influential at this point, is, really agonizing over his decision here about how he's supposed to treat the king. And he's the king after all. So here he is, wondering what he's going to do. And he decides, okay, we'll take the king to trial. So here they are at the trial, trying the king for, sedition against the state. Usually when they say that you've committed, something against the state, a type of treason thing, it's treason against the king. And so the king is sitting there saying, how can I commit treason against myself? So he doesn't understand at all what they're trying to do. He never quite got to the idea that he needed to humble himself. He never got there. And so they've decided, well, we're going to try him for treason. And they found him guilty. He never really gave up. Like when they asked him to defend himself, he said, I'm the king. God may be the king. Everybody else shut up. That kind of thing. So he's very arrogant that way. And so they're trying at this point to decide what should they do with him. If they lock him up, then the idea of escaping would still be there. These cavaliers that had, supported him in the war, they're going to try to come rescue him, this kind of thing. And so some of his really, his soldiers and his army kept demanding the king's head. They actually wanted him to be executed. And Cromwell just wrestled with this over and over until finally he made his decision. And he sided with his soldiers and he said, they're right, we're going to have to put him to death. And he was ready to go. And so then here's the trial. Here's the king being all arrogant here. And he's found guilty. And they decide that he's going to be beheaded. Okay, so the king is, he's in disbelief. He can't believe this is happening. He said, what are you talking about? And so it's too late at this point. Cromwell basically has made his mind up. He's kind of a guy that was indecisive, but once his mind was made up, that's it. And no going back. And here's the king, and they did it. They did it, y'all. They took his head off. He had a public execution in front of everyone. And here they are holding his head up saying the king is dead. And almost at the moment it happened, while the people are cheering, other people are thinking, oh my goodness, what have we done? What have we done? We don't have a king. What is England without a king? This is thousands of years of history gone in an instant. So they were very indecisive that way. Here we have Cromwell looking at the body. And is he regretting it at this point? We don't know. He feels like that the decision had been his to make, and that he was sort of cornered into that. You can probably tell I feel a little sympathetic towards Oliver Cromwell. All right, here's the funeral, and of course here are some of his loyal cavaliers taking him to be buried, and there's very hurt feelings on even every side here. So now what are they going to do? They don't have a king, and so Cromwell decides to bring them to Parliament and say, okay, we can settle it. We've been telling the king all this time that we can run the country through the Parliament. That'll do the trick right there. So let's get to it. But he could not get the people to agree on much of anything. So here he is. He sets up something known as the Commonwealth. They do have a couple of battles with his new model army against Scotland. They put that rebellion down in Scotland. Then they have a rebellion in Ireland. They put down that rebellion right here. We see right over here, Oliver Cromwell says, that's it. We've got to crush Ireland, and he's very brutal over in Ireland. In fact, some people started to question even his sanity at this point, saying he was so cruel to the people of Ireland. Is this really the guy we want in charge right here? See, here they are just being very cruel, very cruel. All right, now the king, remember, Charles had children, and here's his firstborn son, Charles, who had escaped when all this was happening. Here we see him right here, dressing up as a commoner, escaping, hiding in a tree. Somebody crawled up into a tree and pulled him up in there. So when Cromwell's army came by, they missed him. They didn't see him there. And then the story goes, here's the tree, supposedly, the tree he hid in. This was over toward the coast, by the way. He was going to catch a ship, you see, instead of getting arrested. And they say that this woman, Jane Lane, helped him escape. Getting him out of the tree, she snuck off with him. He was dressed as a commoner. He looks kind of fancy right here. And I can't remember the story if she told people he was her husband or whatever. Anyway, she took him, and he got on a ship and made his way over to France, where, of course, his mother's family were from, right? His mother was a French princess, and he went over there to get the support of the French. So we'll catch up with him soon. Let's go back to Cromwell and see what was going on. Here he is with his parliament trying to establish peace, and they cannot make a decision. He cannot get any of them to get along. And so he dissolved it. He dissolved the House of Lords. He passed something called the Navigation Act, and then he dissolved Parliament. He said this, "For shame, get ye gone. Give place to honester men. You are no longer a parliament. The Lord has done with you. He has chosen other instruments for carrying on his work." So he disbanded it, just like the king had done. So essentially at this point, Cromwell has made himself the most powerful man in the land. He's essentially made himself a king. I will tell you, there were people who supported him, who offered him a crown at this point, and he refused it. Okay, he said, nope, he can't do that. He really felt, I believe he was probably truly trying to do God's will. Okay, so maybe I'm cutting him too much slack here. I don't know. You can make your decision if you read anything about him. But he thought that God had not called him to be a king. Yeah, so he knew better than to do that. Okay, so now we have the true Commonwealth. He calls himself the Lord Protector, and he starts basically writing laws himself, passing the laws himself. Now, he's a Puritan, right? So there were certain things that he thought were sinful and that we shouldn't be doing, people shouldn't be doing. So bear baiting was one of them. That's where they would have a bear that was chained up, and they would give him, treats, and then they would kill him. I mean, it was a blood sport. It was horrible. He said Christmas was not, Jesus wasn't born at that time. We're not celebrating cakes and parties and presents. We're celebrating the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ. You shouldn't debase it with commercializing it. So he forbade Camp Christmas. He closed taverns because people would get drunk there. He closed theaters because people there were watching, shows that maybe were not fully glorifying God. So he was looking at the Puritan ideal. Now, it backfired on him a little bit. As you can imagine, the people, even though these things he might be right about these things, it kind of made people not enjoy the fun things of life anymore. And so they started thinking, man, he's getting rid of all of our fun things, And so this is where that idea of puritanical comes in, that the Puritans didn't want anybody to ever have any fun at any time. It's a little unfair. He was actually kind of a funny guy. He enjoyed he enjoyed having parties, actually. And that he didn't outlaw alcohol, because at the time, alcohol, of course, was the way to keep your water clean, right? So ale and stuff like that, the alcohol actually purified the water. So he didn't outlaw that. It was just taverns, because in taverns people got into fights and things like this. But it became kind of real dour, if you will, in the land. Okay, in 1658 he dies, and he had some bouts with depression. He always wondered, was he doing God's will? Was he doing the right thing for the people of England? So when he died, the people wondered, well, what in the world's supposed to happen now? He did have a son. His name is Richard. Here he is. And he had said that he thought Richard should take over as the Lord Protectorate. Well, Richard was like, yikes, I wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't made of the same kind of stubborn metal that his father had been made from. And so that didn't last very long. And so he goes off. So what in the world's going to happen here? This man, General George Monk, came along and he started to introduce the idea of restoring the king to the throne of England. All right? So the House of Lords, which had been dissolved, is now called up. And they had a vote and they said, we really do better under a king. And certainly the king will have learned from the mistakes of his father, and that he will allow us to continue on with more of a constitutional monarchy, things like this. And so, habeas corpus, remember, was put into the Magna Carta, and they brought that back now, and they said that everybody's under the same law, that everybody has the right to appear before a judge, and that kind of thing. So Monk said, as long as we have these things, let's invite the king back. This is 1660. And what did they do? They asked Charles, who had been over in France, waiting, hoping to have an army rise up against England at some point. He didn't have to. They invited him back, and he's now going to become the king as Charles II. He returns from exile. Here he is, to great fanfare on a ship coming in. This is called the Restoration, so restoring the kingdom to the king. So it's Charles's son, Charles II. When he dies, he's going to end up not having any legitimate children, so his brother, James, will take over as James II. But you see, Charles was king for some time here. Yeah. So let's look at his reign right now. He's called the Merry Monarch. Okay. He, like his dad, he liked parties and things like this, but we're going to say he wasn't quite as disciplined as his father. Not that his father was that disciplined. I wanted to put this in here. This is called the King Charles Cavalier Spaniel. This is named after King Charles II. And also, I believe, in honoring of King Charles I, because Cavalier, right, that would be the guys that supported him during the war. Beautiful dogs. They're little tiny things. And you can still, find that today. So the first thing one of the first things that Charles did when he got there was to dig up the body of Oliver Cromwell and hang him for treason. Okay, so I don't think he was very forgiving toward what had happened to his father. Furthermore, anyone that had been involved with his father's execution, he wanted those people tried and put to death. A lot of them, of course, by this point had died anyway. Some of them fled the country at that point. And then you can see in this little comic here, at last Cromwell is getting what he deserved, a traitor's death. So certainly the public sentiment had turned against Cromwell at this time. Charles is called the Merry Monarch, right? He's going to bring all those things back. We're going to have the theater again. We're going to have, those entertainments again. We're going to have the taverns open, this kind of thing. Oh, this is supposedly the head of Cromwell, that once he was hanged, then they took his head off and put it on a pike and put it at the castle there for everyone to see. This is what happens to traitors. All right, so here we are. We have our new regime here with pomp and circumstance, with all sorts of parties and beautiful clothes and art and stuff like this. And one reason we know so much about what was going on at this point of time was because this man, his name is Samuel Pepys. It's spelled P-E-P-Y-S, but it's pronounced Pepys. He wrote a diary, and I'm talking an extensive diary. Look at the volumes he has over here. Each year is a volume. You can read it today. And he gave us a beautiful, synopsis of the things that were going on during the reign of Charles II. In 1665, he writes down that a plague comes to London. All right? So that's true. This was the plague, y'all. This is the Black Plague that ended up killing so many people. This is the bring out your dead, right? People dying in the streets. This is the bubonic plague, the one that attacks the lymph nodes and causes those giant black, bulbous things at your throat that we call buboes, which is why it's called the bubonic plague. And it's at this point, and I'm talking lots of death. I believe we're talking at least a third of the air of the people are dying here, and maybe it's more than that. You know. All right, so here they are picking up the bodies in the street. You've probably seen shows about this that may be even making fun of this thing right here. In 1666, something happened. So that's an ominous sounding year, right? 1666. This is when the Great Fire of London began. And what happened? This is supposedly Pudding Lane, and there was a baker there, and the bakers, of course, had their ovens that were kept lit, right? And at night they're supposed to put the ovens out. Well, at night this oven was not put out properly, and it caught everything on fire. And London was a very crowded city, and everything was made of timber there, and so the fire spread very, very quickly throughout, and it burned a good portion of the city. So here it is, 1666. Is it judgment from God? Or the people are starting to wonder here? And look, you see the city just on fire. This is an artist rendition, of course. Now, the wealthy people who had lived in London had moved out of the city by this time because of the plague. The people who couldn't afford it had to stay in the city, and of course were subject to possibly being exposed to the plague. Interestingly, the king, of course, was outside of the city. Also was a guy named Sir Isaac Newton. Newton was out of the city because he was wealthy, but from where he was, he could see, actually in 1666, he could see the city burning from wherever he was. So we can see here, this quote up here in the corner is from Pepys's diary. It said, "It made me weep to see it. The churches, houses, and all on fire and flaming at once, and a horrid noise of the flames made." This is the River Thames down here. The fire started somewhere here near the river, and as it spread Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, look at how much of the city is being destroyed in this fire. It's called the Great Fire of London. Now, to his credit, the king showed up in the city at this point, and he helped to put the fires out. Here he is coming with buckets of water to try to put the fire out. So he did work. That's true. He actually did come. He was very heroic to do that. And afterward, the city had been destroyed, pretty much. A good more than half the city had been destroyed. Now, there was one good bit of news that comes out of this. Guess what was over now? Guess what ended? The plague. The plague was gone. Remember, we learned how the plague was carried on fleas on rats? Well, guess what happened to these rats during the fire? Well, they perished. They were killed by the fire. Yeah. And so now Charles is faced with rebuilding the city. Hooray, he can make this beautiful, gorgeous new city, kind of like how, Nero did to Rome, right? And this is one of the people he hired. So he hired Sir Christopher Wren, one of the great architects in history, and he's going to design the new St. Paul's Cathedral. So you probably learned about St. Paul's earlier because it was certainly in London, but it was not the one you see today. So Christopher Wren is going to design something magnificent with a big, huge dome on it like this. Just beautiful, which you can see today. It's still there. Here it is. That's a picture of it. Interestingly, during World War II, when there were bombs coming over England, St. Paul's did not get bombed. Yeah, it survived the Nazi bombings, fortunately. All right, so how is the king going to rule as a king? What's he going to do as far as religion goes right here? He has something called the Declaration of Indulgence. That means he's not going to prosecute any Catholics. Nonconformists, of course, would be some of those separatists. So in other words, those religious laws are going to be loosened a little bit. He's still part of the Church of England. He's still a Protestant, quote unquote, in that particular case. But he's going to let Catholics have more freedoms. Some people got suspicious of this. He passed the Test Act. He favored religious toleration, but Protestants were concerned that he was going to be too Catholic at this point, right here. And so, but he did require that everybody would go to the Anglican services, so that helped to assuage the worries of some of the Protestants somewhat. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit over to France. Remember, Charles had been in France. His family was there. So what was going on while this was all happening in England? What was their response to this? They, of course, were horrified by Charles I being executed and all that kind of thing. Because remember, his wife was a French princess. By the way, I believe James, the brother of Charles, also marries a French princess, is going to be a problem. The last time we left France, we left Louis XIII. Remember, he had taken over after his father, Henry IV, had died. Here's his mama, Marie de Medici, who was running the country in his place. I mean, as a regent, right? She was the regent in charge because he was a boy when he took over. His minister was Cardinal Richelieu. He's the one we talked about with the 30 Years' War. Remember, he helped wage that war and win it basically for the Protestants against the Holy Roman Empire. And he was the teacher and the tutor of the young king. Here he is back at that 30 Years' War and helped to win that for the Protestants. Now, Louis grew up and he took over acting as king when his mother, he kind of really kicked his mom out, essentially. But he had a woman he married called Anne of Austria, and she did not have a child. She had several pregnancies that were not successful. So here she is childless. The people of France are just in agony because they don't have anybody to take over after Louis XIII. And then there was a major effort at prayer. Louis XIII dedicated France to the Virgin Mary in 1638 and had a specific prayer of a child coming to his wife. And guess what happened? Lo and behold, here it is. He was called Louis Dieu donné. Dieu donné is the French word for God given. It's a miracle baby. There he is, wrapped up in his lace. And it would bring unbelievable glory to the French country. So he's going to be called Louis the 14th. He's a mama's boy. Here's Anne. She's doting over him. Most women, queens, didn't raise their own children because, of course, they were busy doing things queens do, entertaining, diplomats from other countries, things like this. But she doted on him, and she spent a lot of time with her young son, and they had a loving relationship. So his father died. He was only 4, so he becomes Louis XIV, Louis XIV, when he is only 4 years old. His mother, of course, is the regent for him. She's helping to run the country. We've seen that typically, especially in France. It's quite the deal here. Now, I believe that by this time, Richelieu had died, and we have a new cardinal that is the tutor of the young boy. His name is Mazarin, the minister of France, and helping to raise the boy and also to help the mother run the country, this kind of thing. When the boy was still pretty young, there was a situation that took place in the streets of Paris. French nobles actually joined with townspeople to rebel against the leading of Mazarin, and they had this thing called the fronde. So fronde means sling. So a sling is, of course, where you would take what do we call that thing over there? A slingshot, right? You would put a rock in there and aim it at somebody. So it's a weapon, right? It would be a weapon, a very humble weapon that maybe the poor people would be able to afford. And so they're making this sort of charge against the king here. They build up barricades in the streets. This is going to be repeated over and over again in Paris. If you ever seen Les Miserables, it's one of those future times when they're putting up barricades in the streets to keep the king's army from coming in and controlling the people of the town. But Louis was able to put down the rebellion. Here he is. You can see him here as a young boy. And he said this will never happen again. He was going to put down certain rules that would keep the public from ever rebelling in such a way again, right here. So here he is victorious. He had a special affiliation for the god Jupiter. So here he is dressed up as Jupiter. And notice he's holding those lightning bolts right there. This would be Zeus of the Greek deal. And he'd say, I'm the ultimate god here. I will strike you down if you rebel against me. And furthermore, he thought that he had so much glory that he called that glory the glory of the sun. So he started calling himself the Sun King. And that's actually a picture of him at his great palace that he built. He said, L'État, c'est moi, which is translated, I am the state. The state, it is I. So if you have a problem with anything, you come to me. I'm solving everything. I don't need parliament. I don't need nothing. I'm in charge. he decided there's a thing called the Estates General that hadn't been called for a while. It's the advisory board. It's the parliament, if you will. He said, no, this is not necessary. I will make all the decisions. I don't need you. He wasn't under the same constraints as the King of England. He didn't need to get money from them. He's wealthy on his own. So he has absolute power. Here he is with people coming to see him in his great palace that he's going to build. Now, there were wars. There were people who rebelled against this. You can see, so he's going to be Louis XIV, right here, orange. He's going to gain some lands, Alsace, right here. After the 30 Years' War, it had gone to France anyway. All right, so he is, when he was young, he was actually out with his armies. He was accomplished. Let's call him a very Renaissance type guy. He was much into art and everything, but also into the other side, the warfare, things like this. He said that the Edict of Nantes, remember this, was passed by Henry IV. That was the toleration of the Huguenots, the Protestants. Well, this is going to be revoked by Louis XIV. He said, no, we're Catholics, that's all there is to it. I'm going to revoke this, and the Huguenots are going to once again be persecuted. Here's the edict. This is, by the way, a picture of him. Once again, here's a person who really likes to be painted. He wears these amazing wigs right here, and look at his clothing. Oh, my goodness. And high-heel shoes. That was very, very popular with men at the time to wear these high-heeled shoes. So the Edict of Fontainebleau, remember Fontainebleau was built by Francis I. It was the beautiful palace that was built. And he passes this in 1685. We have determined that we, being himself, that's the royal we have determined that we can do nothing better in order wholly to obliterate the memory of the troubles, the confusion, and the evils which the progress of this false religion has caused in this kingdom, than entirely to revoke the said Edict of Nantes. And there it goes. Boom. Religious freedom gone. So I put this picture in here because I'm going to say a lot of the Protestants were some of the big thinkers of the time, and there was a brain drain, they call it. So a lot of these accomplished Protestants at this point left the country, and the king said, fine with me, be gone. Didn't like you much. So he's going to start now building the most glorious of the French castles of all, called Versailles. There's actually the town is named Versailles. It's just outside the city of Paris, probably about, I'm going to say 15 miles or so out. So if you go visit Paris, Versailles is a little day trip that you take, and it's stunning. It is really hard to believe the beautiful nature of this big thing. Here's an actual picture of it. So this is all, we're looking out the gardens here, so the palace is behind us. So the little town out here is called the town of Versailles. It is a tourist area now. These are all gardens right here. Beautiful gardens, like La Tuileries. Here's the actual palace. And on the other side, you can see, is all this beautiful forest land right here. So just stunning. Look at that parquet floor. And then we'll look at the inside. This is called the Hall of Mirrors. So it's a hall going down. We have windows on this side. These are all mirrors. This was all very, very expensive at the time. The mirrors, of course, would give the illusion of the room being much bigger. The art, the opulence of even the cornice work up here it's like I said, it's stunning. We'll see this Palace of Versailles used for various other political means well after Louis XIV, and today, of course, one of the largest tourist attractions in all of France. There's a great story that happens about this time, written by a Frenchman named Alexandre Dumas, and it's called The Man in the Iron Mask. And the idea here is that somebody wearing a mask was put in jail at this time, and the idea, according to Dumas in the book right here, is it's the twin brother of the king. Okay, it seems to me that it's made up, obviously. I will say there was a person. He wasn't wearing an iron mask. He was mostly wearing a velvet bag over his head whenever they moved him from one place to another. But there were all sorts of stories out there. So if you ever want to look into this, I believe this picture right here is from a fairly recent movie, because I believe the actor there is Leonardo DiCaprio, playing the Man in the Iron Mask. We don't know who he was. It's interesting to watch and ponder and that kind of thing, but that's from this era right here. Here's his family, so we can see. I really, to be honest with you, can't figure out if this is Louis or if this is Louis. It must be him, right? Yeah, or maybe he's in there twice. That wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility for him. He really, really enjoyed putting himself in pictures, especially in a very classical setting like this here. So his wife is in here somewhere, and all of his children, of course. He had a grandson, so we're going to see one of these guys might be his grandson, called Philip. And by this time in Spain, the king of Spain had no children. Okay, I think his name was Diego, and he had such a. I think we'll cover him. Remember the jaw, the Habsburg jaw that was so jutting out. His jaw was so badly deformed he could barely eat, and he didn't survive to much in his adulthood, and so he didn't have any children. And so at this point, Louis wants to put his grandson on the throne of Spain. And so the rest of Europe is furious about this, and so a war develops. There's his grandson. This is Louis the 14th. This is his grandson. So the war breaks out, the War of Spanish Succession. Who will be the next king? Louis will end up winning that, and Philip will become the king of Spain at that point, which we'll come back to that when we look at Spain. All right. The king also wanted to improve Paris, and so he was the one that built these wide avenues of streets here. He kind of tore some buildings down, wide, straight avenues, and the most famous, of course, being the Champs-Élysées. This is called the Champs-Élysées. It's the main thoroughfare, the main street through Paris. It all joins up. So this big fat one right here is Champs-Élysées, this way, and it ends up in this little circular. This is a roundabout. Those are cars going around there. Okay, to come and exit off, just like a regular roundabout. And that is called the Arc de Triomphe right here. We'll find the history of this. It wasn't here yet, okay? But the idea, remember how Louis called himself the Sun King? So he wanted the Champs-Élysées going straight through and the other streets going off in rays like this, okay? So this area today is called L'Étoile. L'Étoile in French means the star. And of course, the sun is a star. But that's the idea. The king wanted to model the city after himself, if you will. So he's the one that created this kind of modern part of the city. Here it is at night, a different view. Beautiful. You can see that kind of star-looking thing there. Now remember, this is the city. He's living at Versailles, which is about 15 miles outside of the city. These are the streets of Champs-Élysées today. If you walk along here, I will tell you, I've been to Paris, and it's fabulous. Walking along the streets here. Beautiful. And I remember we stopped in a little like cafe right here, one of these kind of like this, and we had crepes. It was with bananas and Nutella. Oh my goodness, y'all. Seriously, you got to go and have the Nutella crepes in Paris on the Champs-Élysées. Yeah, okay. Have fun with that. Okay, we're moving on to Russia. Now, if I had talked to you about what was taking place in Russia in week 20, you will have learned about Ivan the Terrible there and why he was terrible. Okay, the reason why he ended up being terrible was because he ended up killing his son. Okay, and that, so this is him right here. Okay, and he had this other son, Dmitri and Fyodor. So Fyodor was, for the lack of a better term, he was, is that right, an idiot. Okay, sorry. So I don't mean to put him down at all. I'm just saying that he wasn't mentally 100%. Now, earlier you would have read that Ivan the Terrible actually ended up killing his first son, also called Ivan, who was supposed to take over. So now Fyodor, who was one of his youngest children from his first marriage, is now the heir apparent. There was a little brother, much younger than Fyodor. His name is Dmitri, and he was from a different wife. And so Dmitri was this pleasant young boy, and everybody loved him, and he was a kind of a delightful guy. And something weird happened with him that he ended up in the playground area down in the castle dead. Yeah. So this is little Dmitri. Okay, so I don't know if people thought that Fyodor had done it, or I'm not exactly sure, but it was a mystery for sure. And now Fyodor's going to take over, but he's not very bright mentally. And so he was married to a woman, and this woman's brother is this man. His name is Boris Godunov. Now, since Fyodor wasn't very bright and able to run the country, it was the time that Boris Godunov pretty much ran the place. Now, I kind of like his name right here. This is Boris Badinov. I don't know if you've ever watched those cartoons, but it's kind of a play on this. But Russia turns into this area where they call the time of the troubles because the leadership really isn't it's not really part of the czars at this point. So Boris is really running things, and he's apparently not doing very well. So who's going to be the czar? So here we have Fyodor right here. So Ivan and his first wife, whom he loved very much, he killed their first son, right, Ivan. And so we have Fyodor. We have Dmitri, the little one that ended up dead in the playground area. But Fyodor has a wife who has a brother named Boris. Okay, Boris has a son also named Fyodor, probably named after his brother-in-law. But we have somebody else over here. We have this other branch off of Ivan's, here. So this would have been Ivan's sibling. And so we have cousins over here. And we come down here to Michael. Notice the last name, Romanov. We have Michael here. And they have a son called Alexei. And Alexei has a son called, well, here's Michael right here. And Alexei has a son called Peter. Okay, so that's where we're going. So after the time of troubles during Boris Godunov's reign, he wasn't able to really get his son Fyodor to really get popular at all. And so it's going to shift over here to this area. We see Michael's going to take over as Michael Romanov. He's going to become the Tsar. And then his son and his grandson. So the guy we really want to key in here is Peter the Great. All right, so I believe this is the throne room here, and Peter, I believe, is getting coronated at this time. He was reasonably young when he became the new Tsar, and he became known as Peter the Great. Okay, so what made him great? At the time in Russia was still sort of, people might say, backwards. They had sort of old world philosophies. They were part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. So it was, kind of in a Catholic way, kind of like that. Instead of a pope, they have the patriarch, that kind of thing. So what's Peter going to do? He is going to actually modernize the country. You can't see up there, but it says Tour of the West. So Peter went on a big grand tour of the Western European countries. He wanted to see what they were all up to. He wanted to see what the King of France was doing, what Germany was up to, all those different states in Germany, what was going on in England, all these kind of things. And he decided he was going to modernize and he was going to westernize Russia and make it European. You can see here he's wearing European clothing. He's going to bring that back with him to Russia. There were going to be huge cultural reforms. So he decided that these Russians that were wearing these really long beards, keep in mind Russia is a very cold place, so these big, heavy, long beards would, of course, been something which would keep them warm. Just to be very, practical there. But Peter saw that as being too Russian. Okay, we want to be more Western. We're going to have a clean-shaven face, like the Western kings do. Louis and those kind of guys right there. So if somebody wanted to keep their beard out of religious devotion, or they really love their beard, they had to buy this coin. So it would be a tax, a pretty expensive one. And if somebody came across him and it was obvious they had the beard, and he would have to show this coin saying he had paid the tax to have his beard tax right there. But Peter literally ordered the beards to be cut. So people had to come and they were forced to have their beards cut. Okay, so here the empire is huge. I will say much of it all up in here is very cold. It's frozen most of the time. In fact, this area is known as Siberia. Okay, and Siberia is like frozen all the time, and call this the Russian steppe. It's just above the Mongol steppe right here. Steppe would be like a prairie, often covered with snow. We're going to see right over here, Moscow was the capital, but we're going to see Peter's going to actually take on some territory right here. Notice the purple stuff's added by Peter right here, Novgorod as well. He's going to add this area right here, and he's going to build a new city. He really, really wanted a port. All these ports right here were too cold. They were frozen almost all year long. So he wanted a warm water port. This would be frozen a lot, so he's going to end up coming and trying to get a warm water port down here at the Black Sea eventually. But he's going to build a big palace in a new city, a brand new city called St. Petersburg. You could say it's named after Peter, the apostle to Jesus, technically, but it is obviously named after Peter the Great. So he built this very modern city on the port right there. He would have ships coming in there as long as it wasn't super cold in the wintertime. Like I said, he's going to look for a warm water port later. He will rebuild the Navy. Here he is. He says, okay, we need a Navy to compete with the rest of the world. And he's not just building a Navy. He is literally learning the art of shipbuilding himself. All right. appreciate Peter because one of his great quotes is, I am a student and need to be taught. Or maybe it was, I am a pupil and need to be taught. He always wanted to learn something new. So he's going to be our Russian version of a Renaissance man. And the Navy was a success. Here it is. He built it up. All right. And so we'll get back to Peter at some other time. But this should, hopefully, you would have found the answers for all of your notes that were given to you in your curriculum. All right. So I'm done for today. And I hope y'all are all well. And we will definitely get together next week. And I'll see you then. Have a great week.